See your storm as a gift and not think about why is this happening to me.
You can only connect the dots moving backward, Do you see now why you had all these storms?
If I was stripped of my cognitive capabilities, if I was stripped of my vanity aesthetics, could I still give myself permission to love myself?
How do we allow ourselves to feel fully?
Wow.
How did you do that?
And know that grieving is a privilege.
Hi everyone, my name is Tanya Gromenko and welcome to my podcast Seasons of Courage, where we interview inspiring people, uncover their life journeys, and hopefully this can help you guys to take a courageous step in your own life. So before we dive in, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel for new updates. Okay, so today on the podcast, I am so excited to have my friend Jack. Welcome, Jack.
Hello.
So nice to see you here.
To be here.
And I'm so excited for you guys to listen to this conversation today, because today we are going to talk about something special. It will be about the courage to rebuild your life after a transition, after loss, after major life changes, basically when life doesn't go according to the plan. And when we met with Jack in 2024 through the entrepreneur community, I was actually really impressed with how successful you seem to be, because you built a really good corporate career, then transitioned into entrepreneurship, and everything seemed to be so great, But when I actually learned your personal story, I was so shocked, honestly, and it really inspired me in so many ways to go through my own, crisis in life at that time. And I really want to uncover that. So I know that you have been through major life transitions like divorce, remarrying again, and then losing your child, being diagnosed with an illness which completely changed your life, right? And also transitions through from the successful corporate career to entrepreneurship, losing your identity as a corporate successful woman, right? And so there are so many things to uncover here. Yeah. So I wanted to start with asking you, so before all of that happened, all of these transitions, and when you were building your corporate career successfully, how did you look? How did you feel your life will look like? Did you have an image of a perfect life that you were going to build?
Wow, sometimes I don't even know what I'm going to eat for lunch. So to think about a 10-year plan, but I don't know how to answer you in that case. I think the practice that I'm really working on is how do I be present where my feet is at, where my present moment is. Mm-hmm. I am definitely a planner. So I have where I want to hit my financial stability, where I would like my family to be, my relationships. But I would say I keep them as like North Stars versus having like a complete like gang chart of my life.
Okay.
But I think what's more important is really how can I be present in this current moment so that I can truly maximize and live the breaths that I've been given the opportunity to breathe. Yeah.
So it was like that back then, right? Before all this?
I think back then, before like the three major storms that you just mentioned, I am a middle child. I grew up insecure. I've always wanted to prove myself. I wanted to be liked. And it's very humbling for you to say that my career seemed very successful. I hit pretty good milestones, but inside I always had the imposter syndrome that it was not enough, that I needed to do more and needing to prove. But I think the fundamental aha moments were actually when the storms hit. So the first storm specifically was when I found out I was type 1 diabetic. It's an autoimmune disease. And I was 15 kg lighter than now. I loved the anorexic look. I had a thigh gap. My collarbones were showing. I thought, okay, got it in terms of the model look. But yeah, I was completely wrong. My body was wasting away, and there were very clear signs likened to my bed being completely soaked down to the mattress, fighting with extreme fatigue and brain fogs. But I thought that that was my storm to weather. My excuse was, I don't know how it is to feel or be in anyone else's body. But that really taught me that titles, chasing after success, trying to prove to others, it's not as important, but it's just really what can I control in my current moment, and will I give myself permission to love myself despite the external titles. Yeah, I learned two specific things there. As I mentioned to you, learning to be present in the moment. As someone who I think I'm undiagnosed ADHD, I'm always thinking about the future, always thinking about what to do next, and I struggle with being present. So I remembered telling myself I need to be more present where my feet is at. I need to listen and tune into my body. And the second most important lesson there was I realized that vanity was something that I didn't recognize was so important. Vanity in two ways. Aesthetics, because from losing where I am now at 50 kg to then being on insulin, gaining 20 kg within a month, from being anorexic thin to looking like a fishbowl. I didn't realize how much vanity was to me because I took it for granted. But I think the second and deeper vanity part was my ego, because I like to think that I can conceptualize things quickly. I'm relatively sharp. Things come quite easy to me, especially numbers or logic. But during that time, I remember seeing myself almost like an outer-body experience in a conversation like this. I could be leading a meeting, and that third-party bird's-eye view is saying, like, what did you just say? That made no sense at all. Like, logic was so highly impaired. And that was something that really crushed my identity. So if I was stripped of my cognitive capabilities, if I was stripped of my vanity aesthetics, could I still give myself permission to love myself?
Oh, that's so deep.
Could I still give myself the permission to see myself as loved by my family, by God, and recognize that I'm so much more than just what the world has celebrated me and has gained my confidence because I've been promoted, I've been celebrated. But when that's all stripped away,
who do you become, right?
Who am I? And will I give myself the allowance, the invitation to even be okay with loving myself first? Yeah. So I think that's what really taught me to, control my controllables, pause, and be present where my feet is at. Yeah. Not sure if I'm answering your question.
Wow, yeah, you answered in such a deep way, actually. Yeah. So what helped you to go through that period, Because in the moment, it must have felt like your life has broken, right? Like, probably.
To be honest, I think I'm a woman of faith. So God, faith is definitely something that allowed me to be able to surrender because I know I have someone that has my back. Thankfully, I've been very, very blessed to have a huge group of friends and family that truly care about me. And sometimes it's overwhelming in terms of the amount of love, flowers, text messages that people reach out. And I feel very privileged because in my second storm, when we lost Nathan, I sought help. beyond just therapy. I wanted to be part of a group that of women who had also lost their children. And so I joined the group probably a month-ish after losing Nathan. And some people in the room had not spoken. They had lost their child maybe a year plus ago, maybe 6 months, maybe 8 months. I think it was a group of like 7 or 8 of us. And some of them shared that they had no one to speak to, or that they were only being ridiculed by maybe their mother-in-law or their friends on like how could they have done better and what choices they could have made. And I walked out of that first session like completely confused. I went for a long walk with my husband and I was like, I can't believe how little support or a little allowance people give to themselves to even want to share because they're so frightened of judgment. They're so frightened of condemnation. They are really going through a storm, and it's at this time that we need our family, our friends, God to really, we can't do this alone.
Yeah.
But it was shocking to know like that people don't have that. And I told my husband, I was like, there's such a big need to be able to share more and to hold space for people because I might have taken for granted because I have such a good network of support.
Yeah.
But without that, without reading all your books and all the stuff that you can control, but without your community,
It's so hard. Yeah.
it's impossible. Yeah. You might just surfacely get over the grief, but grief is not linear. Grief hits you in waves. Yeah.
So is it something that inspired you to actually start the journey of helping people become a wellness and leadership coach?
Yeah, no,
Okay.
definitely. So when I first got diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, that was about 7 years ago. So I already started holding space, holding workshops, and because I felt like a mandate to tell people, get your health tests, because I found out about my type 1 diabetes from a health test. I realized how broken the health system was in Singapore.
Do you mean
And-
just a general checkup?
Yes,
Or-
just a general checkup. You can get so many indicators, which at the age of 35, I had never taken a health test. And if I didn't take it, I would have gone into diabetic coma because my blood sugars were beyond the charts. But I won't go into too much of that. But to answer your question, so that was the first time I felt like I need to tell people, take ownership, listen to your body. But when we lost Nathan and then I left my job and I decided to really just heal, start radical pause, I realized that people might not have the same situation where they have lost a child and they're not grieving that way, but maybe they have lost a parent, a sibling, a friend. Or maybe it's not even a loss of a life, but maybe it's a loss, a grief of their previous identity. As you mentioned, when I left work, who do I introduce myself as? People ask in Singapore, what do you do?
It's always the first question. Yeah.
It's straight away. Then I was like, what do I do? I'm like, I'm healing. Like, I'm focusing on trying to find balance. And so you might be grieving your previous identity. You might be grieving a relationship loss. For example, my previous relationship. And then what are you moving into? Who are you if you were too tagged to a previous relationship? So I feel like grief is actually something that we all have, but we might be grieving different things. And it still needs that intentional pause because human beings, we have the privilege to feel. And but a lot of times we've been told, don't feel,
Exactly.
just get up, move on, especially
Be
in a
positive.
fast-paced positivity is great, but it can be weaponized if not used in the right way. So it's so important to pause. And as a facilitator, it's such a privilege to be able to help people reframe, help them decide what's the difference between their fact, your story, see the opposite way. See your storm as a gift and not think about why is this happening to me as a victim, but why is this allowed in my story? How is this happening for me? And how do I seek the meaning now in the storm versus on hindsight? Yeah.
I also really like when Steve Jobs said that you can only connect the dots moving backward, you know? So talking about that, like, do you see now why you had all these storms? Or you already saw it in that moment?
No, I would say it's a practice. So
Okay.
definitely in my health episode, I was much younger.
Yeah.
Now in my 40s, so that was my 30 self. But then when we lost Nathan, I remember catching myself because I was definitely spiraling down, breaking down. I was really, really allowing myself to somatically like feel. But I was also like, why is this happening to me? What could me and my husband do better in order to like prevent things? But I did shift into radical gratitude, which is something that I highly advocate. And the difference is gratitude always looks backwards. On hindsight, things have passed. So it's easier to see the silver lining. But radical gratitude is in the moment when the storm is still heavy, swirling at super fast velocities, and you feel like you're consumed and overwhelmed. And you're in the storm, so it's not pretending and being ignorant that the storm doesn't exist, but it's seeking meaning in. So that's when I started pivoting and like, how is this happening for me? What are the gifts? How could I list down the things that we're thankful for and we can learn? And it's still hard. It's not easy. But I've allowed myself that you can never be perfect in this.
Yeah.
It's just progression and learning to move forward and shifting perspectives and finding your center because you have a choice. The storm's there. Do you want to be in the vortex or do you want to move towards the center, right? So that's the only choice. You can't will your storm to go away, but you can choose where you want to be.
Yeah. And you said that it's really important to live and feel, live through all these emotions. So what is the right, of course, we focus on radical gratitude. We try our best to go out of the vortex, but how do we allow ourselves to feel fully?
Wow.
How did you do that?
I feel you can always feel more, but how did I allow myself to go deeper? I think it's letting go of judgment of yourself and letting go of the need to feel like you need to recover or bounce back and just
Giving time.
but also being specific. And I feel like naming your emotions it's important because if you just say, I'm sad, it's very surface level. Like maybe you feel like instead of sad, you feel betrayed. Like you feel betrayed on life. I felt angry and betrayed by God at that time. I was like, why? Like naming exactly, and not angry, but maybe I was furious.
Yeah.
Right? Naming it and then going, okay, allowing myself that this is an emotion as a human being. Feel it. I like to scream. I've also maybe I pound something is out. I go for a walk or I exercise a lot to try to get it out. But you really need to feel it in your body. Otherwise, it's just going to be stagnant energy that is somehow going to surface in the future.
Exactly.
And and it might just erupt like a angry Pokemon that just bursts out when you least know it because it's there. It's a stored energy. And if it's not serving you future forward, you need to feel it in order to understand what you have. Then you're able to then choose to let it go. But if you don't feel it, then you're just not, the ability to let it go is it's not possible. Yeah.
So do you need to give yourself a timeline? Like, okay, I grieve for this much, and then I go back to my normal life.
Well, as I mentioned to you, grief is not linear.
It will keep coming back.
And no matter how much grief in the different storms I've gone through, that I like to say I understand grief more than I did in my younger self. Grief is also something I cannot compare with others. So for whoever is listening to this podcast, you have to figure out on your own. Because I will share with you, me and my husband were both grieving Nathan. I journal, I cry, I bang the tables, I go and exercise, I like somatic release. I go for my gong baths, I do everything that's possible. He's watching tennis and rap videos on YouTube. And I'm just like, so I remember the first few days holding it in and going like, being super judgmental. I was like, seriously, like, why are you doing this? But also realizing that people process in different ways. And yeah, he has other avenues in terms of his tennis, his paddle to like release. But also there are certain things that I would never watch a rap video or watch tennis in the grieving phase. But maybe that's his tool, right? But I always advocate to not just do it alone. Do it with people because community will lift you. See a therapist to go deeper because some things need to be facilitated. They might ask you the same questions that you can get on ChatGPT. But being able to be in a space where you feel safe, to be able to explore, to go deep is needed. And to answer your question, it's not linear. It's not something you can put a gang chart to and try to accelerate. You can equip yourself. But I'll share with you, I was playing tennis with my husband maybe like 3 months after losing Nathan. And then halfway, he like, I remember him patting my back. We were playing doubles. And he's like, are you okay? And I'm like, I apparently froze in the middle of the game. And like, I was just so overwhelmed because a memory hit and the grief felt. And we were playing tennis, right? And I was like, I just need a moment. And yeah, so do what you can within your control, but also surrender the outcome. And know that grieving is a privilege. Because if you don't grieve, you probably didn't love, or you probably didn't care enough. So, yeah, in order, feelings, grieving, they're all part of our stories. And your story is different from mine. And we have so much more stories and milestones and storms to overcome. But do we choose to waste that storm, waste that lesson? Or do we choose to learn from it and grow from it? Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. Wow. So much wisdom in that. Yeah. So through all these storms, I mean, after all the storms, it was your moment to, that was your reason to decide to leave your corporate job, right? You wanted to take a pause, right?
Yeah.
And so you focused on yourself and on building your meaningful business, right? Wellness, leadership, helping people, connecting with people. And that's how we met as well, right? I still remember your workshop, how we were, writing a letter to ourselves in 6 months. And I was going through divorce myself, and I was, writing a letter to the future me. And I just realized how much my life really changed in those 6 months. It's so powerful. Yeah. So, what? When did you finally realize that it was time to go back to the corporate world? And I know that you struggled with that loss of identity, corporate identity. So, what made you actually want to come back? To the corporate world?
Yeah, good question. And so I thought I didn't want to go back to corporate world. I really enjoyed what I was doing at at Radical Pause, and I was gaining momentum. So I was getting workshops, I was getting gigs from referrals, and it's really exciting. And also to be able to build your own content. But I realized I actually really like, I know this sounds geeky, but I do like my Excel spreadsheets. I do like being in discussions with smart people. I like that co-creation, which can definitely happen as an entrepreneur because as you grow your team and collaborate. But I realized how much I actually liked that corporate kind of synergies that that I have the privilege of being a part of right now. So I'm working for a friend where I'm working in Moro, which is the largest wellness longevity center that really specializes on preventative health. And I really resonate with the mission and the vision that we're trying to create, not only for Singapore, but for beyond. And I realized that what I'm doing at Radical Pause is one part of the puzzle, but there is so much, as I mentioned to you before, in my own health journey, that there is rooms for improvement. People can change and take ownership over their choices today that will affect their longevity, but also their health span, which is the years that you live well. So I really found that very exciting, and it's also part of my purpose. So I was helping him on a pro bono basis, told him I would join him part-time first. But after the first month of being on part-time, I realized, fine, I'll just join you full-time. So I joined him full-time in June last year, and then here we are. We've just, this month, opening up our medical center, and we're opening up the rest of it's 40,000 square feet. So yeah, still much more to do. But I'll share with you 2 epiphanies that happened. I think it was 4 to 5 months into the job, and I was facilitating a workshop over the weekend. I was doing it at a community center. And it was interesting because my audience also had children inside, so that's not my usual audience. Mm-hmm. And I was facilitating and giving them prompts to get them to think about how are they getting out of this storm, what can they be grateful for. And I had an epiphany going I'm living into my moment. I miss this so much. Man, my corporate job is pulling me away from living into this radical pause of sharing and holding space. And I was really enjoying that moment. But in the split second, from one epiphany to going, oh shit, I don't think I could do this for full time. So I was oh, I really actually like what I do at work. Mm. I like my team. I believe in what we do, and it helped me shift my perspective of not just seeing that as work, but seeing that as also my purpose. And I think coming out of the session, I told my husband, and I was guess what? I had 2 epiphanies back to back, super contradictory to each other. But I think the main thing was how do I find the equanimity, which is a yogic word that stands for the balance of strength and ease. Mm-hmm. So how do I find that equanimity point between pursuing both? To be honest, I don't know yet. But I know both fill my cup. Mm-hmm. And I framed Radical Pause not as my side hustle, but my joy hustle. I've just started changing that. It is my joy hustle. I love facilitating, and I find it a real honor. But at this moment, I'm super committed as well to what I'm building at Moro.
Amazing, amazing. And I love how both of these parts of your life, right, corporate and your own joy venture, they all relate to your purpose, like you said, right? And what you have experienced in your life, right? Health checks, the importance of health checks. And I can say as well that I have experienced your checkup as well at Moro last week. It was definitely one of the most relaxing experiences, because I usually get very anxious when I go to the checkups. But that time it was just so peaceful, so, it was just relaxing,
As compliments to the team, we've got really good people on the team.
Yeah. So congratulations, and I hope that all goes smoothly with your launch.
Thank you. But just to add on one more thing to that, I was just having a conversation yesterday that, so there's 2 main things is I have the privilege of working at Moro because it resonates in the industry, longevity, tech, lifestyle medicine, healthcare, but also wellness and recovery, and just this wonderland of like recovery and preventative health. But I think what really drives me is because I get the privilege to like build people and culture in our company. We're not there yet. There's no, and it's a progress, but being really, from our performance evaluations, what core values do we hold ourselves accountable? Whether you're someone on, like a barista, to a trainer that might be part-time, to a doctor, to my role as general manager, like how do we all hold ourselves to the same standards of how we do our job is something that there's still a lot of work to do. Still a lot of alignment, but that's the part I'm super passionate about because I could be in a company selling rubber bands. I'm thankful I'm in a company that I also resonate with what product we're bringing in, but the people and culture part is where I feel the responsibility in, and because that's what's going to make people stay and also make people do well in their jobs.
Yeah, very exciting, very exciting. And maybe the last question that I want to ask you, through all these experiences and transitions, how did you redefine success for yourself?
How do I redefine success?
What is a success to you now?
I think it's multifold. So, as I mentioned, it's being able to find the equanimity. I mentioned between work, moral, and radical pause, but it's the equanimity of also finding that balance with your family, your friends, your own health, and being able to still move things forward and recognizing that they're all interconnected. So success to me is finding that equanimity points across the different facets of your life. And success to me is, as I mentioned, being present where your feet is at. But when you are faced with storms, trials and tribulations, how are you constantly pursuing that center? Because in every storm, there is an I. And you need to believe it. But being able to move towards that direction, if you're able to do that, you're able to find the equanimity point. I define that as success because no matter if you found your center and the equanimity point in that center of whatever storms things you're juggling, storms are not stagnant. They will get faster or smaller in velocity. They will move. So then whatever point you found today, tomorrow will be different.
Doesn't guarantee tomorrow, right?
So it's the success is that pursuit. There's no perfection, but it's the pursuit to find that center, that equanimity point. Yeah, I would define that as success because I think for me now it's really not about like titles and material goods because that will go away. And you never know when your life is going to be taken.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much, Jack, for sharing your story. I'm sure that all our audience is very inspired by what you shared. And thank you for being so vulnerable, and openly sharing what you have been through. It influenced me personally a lot, and I hope it can influence others as well. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, guys, I hope that you have enjoyed this episode. Please feel free to like this video and sign up to my channel for the next episodes of Seasons of Courage. And see you soon.